If you think about what makes you successful in a scientific environment and lab environment, how success is defined there is very, very different from how we define it in a fully functional capital raising organization. And those things, everything from, talent acquisition to leadership development to how you manage folks to how you strategize, how you collaborate, in a lab, being communicative and collaborative and bringing everybody in and all of their opinions in to inform the next step is a critical piece. But as the CEO of a developing company that's trying to attract capital at every stage, as you move forward in the stages, your ability to collaborate really starts to compromise your ability to keep up with the speed of what your investors are looking for and what your board is looking for, what your potential hires are looking for. You can't collaborate necessarily on everything. Everybody can't necessarily have a voice in all decisions. Everything can't always be perfect all the time. In the lab, obviously it needs to be, but sometimes that PowerPoint has to be just good enough to get the meeting and close the deal. And sometimes that's a hard bridge to cross when you're so used to being so precise and so collaborative with things. But the speed of the deal sometimes requires you to move a little faster than you're used to.
Hey, Soniya, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, no, this will be a fun one, I think. But I did give you the warning ahead of time, as we always ask everybody this question. Give us a funny story that's happened in your career.
Sure. So one of the more circuitous angles of my career was when I got into commercial real estate development. Yeah.
All right.
So, back in 2006 or so, had the opportunity to get into commercial real estate development with Emmett Smith, who we
That's awesome.
yeah. It's
For Nick, explain who Emmitt Smith is for Nick, because he doesn't know.
yeah, he's the greatest running back of all time. Dallas Cowboys, 1990s,
American football.
Running back. Kind of a big deal.
What's he running back from?
I had the opportunity to start this commercial real estate development company with him and with 5 other partners. And the funny part is when I tell this story, people obviously always say, well, how do you know Emmett Smith? And so I say, well, I was introduced to him through Roger Staubach, of course.
Again, more American football references than Nick.
Yeah, you kind of have to know, and you kind of have to, it is, a little bit of an older reference, I guess, at this point. But people find that hilarious as well. But my business partner at the time was very good friends with Roger Staubach. And, he expressed a desire at the time to bring a minority-owned commercial real estate development solution to his company so that we could partner and go after commercial contracts together. And so as we put this together, said, well, Emmett is retiring from football and he wants to I'm mentoring him into commercial real estate. And so, that's how it all kind of came together. But people often find it funny when I say, I did commercial real estate with Emmett, still doing it, but that, I met him through Roger Staubach.
Yeah, that's like the twist in the story. It's like one thing to know Emmitt Smith, it's another one to go providing help. Oh.
And I'm not even a huge football fan. I went to Emmett's Hall of Fame induction in 2010 with my family, and we were hanging out at the post celebration, and I was like, Evan, I just didn't know you were that good.
He's the equivalent here of
he's like the big brother I never wanted. So
he's like Wayne Rooney.
No, the equivalent here is like me opening a bakery with Thierry Henry, but I was introduced by Arsene Wenger.
Sure, there you go. Yes, that is the equivalent. Yes. That's great. Awesome. Well, maybe what would be helpful before we dive into everything we're going to talk about is maybe give a little background on yourself, and then and then we've got some fun topics to go through.
Sure. So right now I am the CEO and founder of Next Stage BioAdvisors, and we are an advisory company that worked with early stage biotech companies as they face a couple of important inflection points, which typically require them to quickly scale their organizations. And so we advise them on how to align their hiring plans to their financial and clinical milestones to scale quickly, efficiently, effectively, sustainably, I'm also the CEO and founder of something called the Catalytic Collective, where I work with executive women in life sciences and biotech to kind of architect their next stage chapters if they're looking to exit the biotech industry. But prior to that, I've been in global consultings where I started my career a million years ago, and I started my consultancy back in 2000 when I was raising very small kids. Wanted to do the work that I love to do, but didn't want to travel all the time, and so starting my own business was the way that I could figure out how to both raise my family and to grow a business at the same time. So I've been in the M&A integration space for my whole career. I've done everything from a global radio show and M&A integration to commercial real estate to just, various entrepreneurial pursuits. But the throughput of my whole career has been around life sciences.
That's awesome. Great. Yeah. Did you and so did you like study life sciences, biotech, or anything in the lab in uni?
No, I am an extraordinarily qualitative.
I love that.
Yeah, I was poli-sci, English composition, and psychology in undergrad. Fully intended on going to law school. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon and really leaned into business and management around human capital strategy specifically, and ended up in life sciences when I was with Accenture. It was Anderson Consulting way back then. And, just doing life sciences, big pharma consulting, which after I started my own company evolved into smaller pharma and then biotech specifically. So it's sort of, I've evolved into it. I'm not the scientist by any stretch, but I do get to kind of upskill the scientists so that they can do what they need to do.
Yeah, I love that. I also did start in the life sciences and then fell into it and then fell in love with it because it's like the stuff that you learn, like the stuff that we're doing here in this space is just so fascinating. And like it's on such a fast trajectory with also like just touching the actual lives of patients with the work that's being done. Whereas like previously I was selling software to like marketing and IT. Like, what am I doing there? That's not that interesting. So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, it's an honor to be in an industry like this. I mean, I'm deeply committed to early stage drug development, to, being part of teams that develop novel solutions for untreated diseases and, not being the science person at all, to get to be on the forefront of that sort of innovation is really an honor. And, it's an interesting place to be as a non-science person, someone that's terrible at math.
All right, well, looks like Nick had some technical difficulties, so he's no longer with us. So it's just going to be Sonia and I to finish this off. But next question before he left was, have you noticed any, sort of like industry differences or nuances, say, between like the life sciences or commercial development or any of the other kind of industries you've been a part of?
When I started my consulting career, it was mostly life sciences, but I worked in consumer products. I worked in financial services. Obviously, I personally did some work in commercial real estate. And, for me, I think the nuances that are different tend to be around compliance and, just sort of the things from a regulatory standpoint that you have to pay attention to. It's very different across industries. Now, obviously the financial service industry is a very compliant industry, but its regulatory and compliance requirements are very different from what you would need in commercial real estate or in biotech and pharma. But regardless of what you're doing, whether it's entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial, being able to stay within the lines of what's required is super important.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I imagine when you're working with a lot of these earlier stage companies, they may generally know what some of the regulations are, what some of the things are that they have to follow. But I imagine many of them are, maybe they are spin out from an academic lab and maybe they don't have as much of that sort of acumen. And so I guess what do you kind of notice there as some of the gaps as maybe you go from technical founder to actually now running a company and you gotta, understand not only the like people landscape, operationally, fundraising, your regulatory. I imagine that's a lot to take on for these people.
Well, at that stage, it is a lot. If you think about what makes you successful in a scientific environment and lab environment, how success is defined there is very, very different from how we define it in, a fully functional capital raising organization. And, those things, everything from, talent acquisition to leadership development to how you manage folks to how you strategize, how you collaborate, in a lab, being communicative and collaborative and bringing everybody in and all of their opinions in to inform the next step is a critical piece. But as the CEO of a developing company that's trying to attract capital at every stage, as you move forward in the stages, your ability to collaborate really starts to compromise your ability to keep up with the speed of what your investors are looking for and what your board is looking for, what your potential hires are looking for. You can't collaborate necessarily on everything. Everybody can't necessarily have a voice in all decisions. Everything can't always be perfect all the time. In the lab, obviously it needs to be, but sometimes that PowerPoint has to be just good enough to get the meeting and close the deal. And sometimes that's a hard bridge to cross when you're so used to being so precise and so collaborative with things. But the speed of the deal sometimes requires you to move a little faster than you're used to.
Yeah, it's like let's say you're a team of 10, you could have all 10 people in a room, and as a CEO or founder, you can be very hands-on in sort of every decision. You can be involved in all of those decisions, but when you're at 50, 100, 200 people, like you physically cannot be involved in all of those decisions. And so I imagine one of the most important things, right, is, well, I guess there's probably two, right? It's like, how do you create that vision and strategy for the organization? How does it permeate down through it? And then how do you get the right people in place to drive that?
Yeah, one of the analogies that I love is that you've got to go from being first chair clarinet to being the orchestra conductor.
I like that.
You may be so good at the clarinet and that's what got you here, but now you've got to walk away from your instrument and you have to lead the entire orchestra. And, that's really, really important. You've got to go from being super, super proficient in one area to good enough to lead and to guide across all of the areas. And certainly surrounding yourself with the right team, stepping back and understanding and recognizing talent and skill and ability, in your initial C-suite that you put together, making sure you're hiring people that have experience that can hit the ground running. You're not necessarily developing your junior pipeline right away, right? You're bringing in experts at that point. So that requires capital, that requires speed, that requires creating an environment that people with experience will say, hey, this is something that's worth taking a shot on. I want to be part of this team, and then selling that team to investors who are investing just as much in that team as they are in the drug and in the strategy, because they want confidence that this is the team that can execute. That's a lot to think about as a new leader.
That's really interesting, which is they're not just buying into your technology and or what it is that you've developed or your therapeutic, whatever it is, they also have to buy into the team that you've built. And I think this is also that sort of transition point where you're going from, I've got this really cool technology, I'm a technical founder, technical CEO, and I can't just go into an investor meeting and show them a bunch of data slides because that's not going to resonate. They're not going to understand what you're talking about. And then how do you then think about hiring that team? Because that team becomes a big selling point. And so I imagine that is probably, I mean, I don't know if it's more important, but it's probably just as important, is hiring the right sets of people and then really selling that team as part of like any sort of a investor pitch or anything.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely critical. And, getting to a place where you understand, a lot of times HR is sort of seen as, personnel. And it's so much more than that. It is a strategic driver. It's a quantitative set of circumstances that align with the strategy and allow you to execute. So if you sort of de-emphasize the role of HR in building out the organization, you really do that at your peril. A lot of times you'll see early stage companies make the mistake of hiring people they know, people they are comfortable with, who may or may not be a sustainable figure for the long growth of the company. So, what your organization structure looks like at the very beginning is very often not the same set of folks, the same structure, the same approach, the same culture that's going to get you to that next stage. Because at some point you begin as a leader, as a CEO and a founder, to be held accountable for the folks that you've put in place to drive, right? And so when an investor is talking to an early stage company and they want to know, well, what is your clinical trial plan? Who's developing those clinical trials? If it's not somebody that has demonstrated experience, expertise, a track record of success in that, it's not going to have a lot of credibility. They're not necessarily going to believe that you're going to be able to develop this drug. They're not going to believe that your CFO can put together the financing plan and the run rate in order to do it if in fact they've never done it before. So, and hiring the wrong people, it's really, really expensive. It can be as much as 2.5 times their base salary to replace them, depending on the role they play in the organization. I mean, those are real quantitative figures that, help me to help CEOs understand it's really important to hire quickly, but effectively, and to align those hires with your financial and your clinical milestones. So you're not hiring the wrong people at the wrong time, or too many people, or not enough people, so that everything that you do, every milestone that you meet, has the people you need to get there, but also justifies the people that you've just brought in.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think biotech has a really unique business model where milestones are so far out in the future a lot of times, and so many things are dependent on like biology working, right? Or dependent on like these things that you can kind of control but not really at the same time. Like you can only do so many tests in vitro before you have to move to in vivo, and then you have to move into people, and it's like because it has these crazy long milestones where if something goes wrong, it can really throw off the entire like program, the entire company. Even something as simple as like outsourcing something to a CRO, where if something doesn't go well, that is a massive problem because the timelines are so long. And then you're battling runway. It's so how do you kind of talk through those decisions with founders where they may not be thinking about like every single milestone or thinking about different scenarios that could occur that may impact like the overall outcome or success of their company?
Yeah, it's a huge risk. I mean, one of the things that's really unique to biotech is the huge risk reward profile that we operate under. And the things that we're doing are so critically important, right? We're developing new drugs, so it's a risk worth taking. But you have to be very, very considered and measured in how you scale the organization to meet really long milestones. You have to kind of see those smaller milestones that lay in between, and hire accordingly. And so a lot of times what I advise is to bring in very experienced but fractional expertise. You're not paying big salaries for something that may or may not, you begin to convert people from fractional to full-time as you get closer to those milestones. As the data starts to mature, it looks a little better. You bring people in that have the risk tolerance for something like that. But you need that expertise, right? You risk it on somebody that's never done it before. That expertise is what's going to attract that capital and extend that confidence. But you start that way, and then you kind of build from there, and then you allow them to build their teams as the milestones reveal themselves successfully.
And when does somebody like what sort of, I guess, milestone, what sort of stage should a founder be thinking about starting this process of hiring these people, right? Hiring, much more experienced people who maybe are more used to managing versus doing, which is probably not something you've hired people for as of yet. And then the follow-up question to that is like, what are some of those things that you're looking for, even in a fractional person, right? Is it, oh, you've done this before, but is it a similar modality? Is it a similar therapeutic area? Like, what are some of those like characteristics that you're looking for too?
Well, so the first characteristics at the very beginning, you're looking for co-founders. You're looking for folks that are willing to operate at risk. Maybe you get a seed partner that can underwrite your operations, maybe provide some sort of remuneration for time spent, but it's really an equity game at that point, right? And you need to get it to a place where you can attract that Series A of capital. And once you get that round of capital in, that's when you can sort of start to bring in the doers. But you're looking for someone that has a really strong commitment to the disease state. You've got somebody that's got, understands the therapeutic area, and has an entrepreneurial spirit and risk tolerance to kind of go for that. And it's, and that really resides strongly in the biotech space. Where you run into trouble a lot of times is trying to conflate pharma with biotech, because it's, they're two very different, in my mind, success profiles, where if you bring somebody out of large pharma and then you place them into biotech, they may not necessarily, they're kind of used to having, big teams, big resources, other things. And, for a long time in biotech, it's going to be all hands on deck, and it's going to be, your finance person is also doing your legal, is also doing your compliance, is also doing your HR, is all, and so it's someone that is really excited and engaged around the idea of starting something new.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so it sounds like you find that co-founder, you get it to the point where now you've got your Series A funding. Is that, you mentioned the doers can come in there, or is that more where you start to look for some of the leadership hires with a lot more experience, or is that maybe more like Series B type timelines?
It's sort of in between. Once you get Series A, you can start bringing in leaders who are also still going to be doers. They're going to be player coaches. And you may be, outsourcing things. You're still using consultants, but you're beginning to invest in systems at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So from a human capital scaling strategy standpoint, that's we want to build the infrastructure so that when we are scaling, we can move candidates through the system quickly and efficiently, and the system won't break. So that's when you take that Series A capital and you start to invest in talent acquisition systems, in human resource information systems, all of the things that underwrite the employee life cycle, because you want to be able to attract really great talent. In order to do that and retain them, that system has to be put in place. So you want to build something, take the time and the expense to build it properly, so that when you're bringing people in, a person a week or whatever it is that you're doing, they're moving through in a way that's effective and efficient, but also well received. And it's a great experience because that's their first experience and vision to the company. And then you're going to want to start to build what the culture is going to be. You've got to be conversant around what's the environment that we're inviting people into, what's important to us, what do we value, and to make sure that anybody that you're bringing into the organization is aligned with that. Because again, it's still going to be very small. We all have to be on the same team, singing from the same songbook.
So as companies are thinking about, let's say they're planning ahead and they're maybe thinking of doing things the right way. So they're like, okay, cool, I need to put these systems in place. Do you have like a set of like core principles or sort of pillars that people like, that you really need to make sure that you instrument, like, I don't know, hiring rubrics or onboarding plans, like those types of things? Or are there some sort of like key areas that people really should be focusing on when they know that they need to do a lot of hiring in a short period of time and get it right?
Yeah, there's sort of a 90-day sprint that I like to take that looks at assessing who we are as an organization right now. So what would the existing employees, however small, what are the things that they would consider to be success markers that got them here and have enabled them to plan for the future? So what are those cultural things? What are those competencies? What are those behaviors that, regardless of how big we grow or how fast we grow, need to remain? And then you use that to build a framework for your talent acquisition and for your onboarding, and then for your for your performance management and talent development. It's never too early to be thinking about those things, because that's the one thing that's going to remain constant. Even as you grow bigger, you're going to, communication is not going to be the same, right? As you get bigger, you're not going to hear from the CEO all the time. You're not going to collaborate across, but we've got to create collaborative work streams without creating silos. Without having that cultural foundation in place upon which to grow, if you don't take the time to do that on the front end, then it's going to be really hard to stitch that together later. And especially when we're working in hybrid and remote environments,
Yeah.
you're trying to figure that out. It's really worth taking that, first, 60, 90 days to put that stuff in place. And that way you understand, from a corporate strategy, how we define those human capital milestones that are aligned. So we know that we want to be first patient in at a certain date. So we need a clinical team that looks like this. And you kind of reverse engineer and to say, okay, we need a process to go find these folks. You're going to find the right folks faster and bring them in. They're going to be excited to come. It's all going to move much more efficiently if you're able to be super conversant, whether you're the talent acquisition person, whether you are the hiring manager, whether you're the team that's part of the interviewing panel. If everybody is singing the same song about what we're doing, why we're doing it, why we're excited about it, and why we're excited about you. All of that stuff is foundational. But once you have it, you just kind of move through it very quickly.
And it's interesting too, because I think with biotech, you have some of that is probably inherent into like the mission is like, we're going to like cure XYZ disease. Like that is a pretty cool mission to be a part of. Whereas like if you're, maybe in just a different type of industry, it may be a lot harder to sort of come up with those types of ambitions and things.
Yeah, I think patient focus is often, one of the core principles or values of every biotech. What goes along with that? Are we collaborative, or and consensus driven, or do we move quickly? I did an M&A integration for a joint venture between a big pharma and a smaller pharma, but the smaller pharma had more market share, and they were actually the driver in the joint venture.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so the employees, the bigger pharma, were like, well, we're the big pharma, of course we're running the show, and they actually weren't. And so when you've got a smaller one, in this case, it was a smaller one that had way more market share. And they describe themselves as nimble. They make quick decisions. They're fast. This is what success looks like over here. Whereas the larger pharma was very collaborative, and everybody needed to be on board, and so they moved slower. Some would say from the outside, that's why the market share was so sort of crazy. Well, at that point, you have to decide, well, which culture wins? Are we consensus driven, or are we nimble? How do we integrate these two? And so, it's important to have that together before you do the transaction.
Yeah. And I think too, even within teams, like if different teams are functioning in different ways, as you start to grow, you got 100 people, you have 5, 6, 7, 8 different teams doing different things, working towards the same goal. They may want to try and set their own sort of like culture on that team. But then if that doesn't align to the company, that's where it's an issue, right? So I feel like if you let the culture persist on its own, you end up with like more of a melting pot probably, which is which is good normally, but in this analogy that I'm using is probably not as good. Where then you have all of these culture clashes where you have people that are like, I want to be involved in everything. And then you have other people that are like, I'm going to go fast and break things, that's.
Yeah. Well, and where you really see that is when you have an R&D company or a clinical company that has successfully done a phase 3, and now it's time to apply for approval and commercialize the drug. So here you're busy going for your phase 3 or your FDA approval, right? And obviously to get to that point in any biotech, that's huge, right? And that is success. But now you're going to impose this commercial organization, which is an entirely different animal. So the cultural tissue rejection that can happen there is a very real, very real thing, because you've got, very methodical, very systemic thinking, clinical folks. And, that's what made them successful, obviously, because look, we got the drug here. And then you've got these commercial folks who are like, fill up my bag. I'm ready to sell. What are, let's go.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you just have to remind people that we are on the same team, but for all of the amazing work of this clinical team, this commercial team would have nothing to sell. But for this commercial team, we would not be putting the drug in patients and on the market and scaling the company and everything else. And so there's a lot of work that has to happen beforehand and make sure that tissue rejection doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a bunch of different stuff here. I guess we're coming up on time, but is there maybe any other sort of last tidbits of advice you could give to anybody who might be either at a smaller company as an employee and trying to think about these sorts of challenges, or founders out there? Yeah, any last words of wisdom?
Yeah, I think the important thing is to identify your company's true north and stick to it. And understanding that culture development and organization design and all of those things are fluid, and they do ebb and flow, but that true north is really, really important, because it enables you to align around a very specific objective and direction. So regardless of who you are in the company, what role you play, what level you are, whether you are a key stakeholder outside of the company, I think this applies to the board, investors, everybody needs to be aligned around that true north.
Regarding the true north, do you think that's something that can be done just within the company, or do you think that it's important to work with outside parties, whether that be consultants, et cetera, in order to refine the thinking? Because I find that oftentimes if you're in an organization, you kind of get groupthink around certain things, and then you don't really have as much like challenging of your concepts or your ideas. It's like, do you find that it's more beneficial when companies do look towards maybe external support in order to refine that true north, refine some of these capabilities? And that you might be biased, obviously, but it's kind of curious from your thoughts.
I think it's important to have both that entrepreneurial and entrepreneurial perspective when it comes to these things. So, if you are placing value and equipping and allowing your organization, learning and OD function within the company to operate as a strategic partner, then you'll have those resources to bring that outside perspective. But the benefit of going outside of the company and using consultants and other resources is they're bringing knowledge and expertise from other scenarios. They're able to see beings that you necessarily can't see, and they're able to work on these things in parallel. So, it's really important that you're able to both stick to your knitting and do what it is that you are tasked to do in terms of drug development and everything else, but finding partners that can in parallel equip you and your teams and your leaders to think strategically, to do all of these things is also really important. That outside perspective can be really, really valuable.
Yeah, I definitely agree as well. But, yeah, this has been great. So I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your wisdom, expertise. And then we educated Nick on some concepts related to American football. So it's great.
This has been awesome. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Well, have a good one. We'll talk soon.